Welcome to a deep dive into a topic that's always in the news but rarely understood with any depth: corruption. We've got some fascinating research lined up for you today. We'll be looking at how corruption becomes normalized in organizations, how people rationalize unfair systems, and even how our relationships can cloud our judgment when it comes to evaluating information.
It's really a multi-layered issue. We're going to take you from the individual level, psychology, all the way to the systemic factors that allow corruption to flourish.
Let's jump right in with this research by Blakey Ashforth and Vikas Anand, who outline a framework called the Three Pillars of Normalization. It explains how corruption becomes so deeply embedded in organizations.
These pillars are institutionalization,
Yeah.
rationalization,
Mm.
and socialization. And what's interesting is how they work together. It's not just a one-time thing. These pillars interact and create a sort of self-perpetuating cycle of corruption.
Okay, so let's break down these pillars one by one. First up, institutionalization.
Think of institutionalization as the process where corrupt practices become so ingrained in the everyday routines and procedures of an organization that they almost become invisible. They're just how things are done, and people stop questioning them.
So it becomes part of the company culture almost.
Exactly. We see this in the infamous Mitsubishi Motors sexual harassment case from the 90s. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission,
Yeah.
EEOC, found a pervasive culture where harassment was rampant, affecting hundreds of women. This behavior was so deeply institutionalized that it was practically invisible to those within the system.
It's a scary thought that something so awful can become so normalized.
It is. And this concept of routine masking harmful behavior isn't limited to harassment. It's really the foundation of how unethical practices become ingrained. Hannah Arendt's chilling phrase, "the banality of evil," comes to mind. It captures the idea that even the most horrific acts can become normalized when they're part of a routine, stripped of their moral weight.
So it's not just about bad apples, it's about the barrel itself being rotten.
Precisely. Now let's move on to the second pillar, rationalization. This is where we delve into the psychology of how individuals and groups justify their corrupt actions.
This is where it gets really interesting to me, because these aren't necessarily evil people, yet they're engaging in unethical behavior.
Right, and to understand this, we need to look at the concept of rationalizing ideologies. These are the mental frameworks that people use to minimize the harm they're causing, shift the blame, or simply deny responsibility for their actions.
So they convince themselves they're not really doing anything wrong.
In essence, yes, and there are many ways they do this. One common tactic is denial of responsibility, where someone claims they were just following orders or that they had no choice.
Right, like blaming the system or passing the buck. What are some other rationalizations?
Another common one is denial of injury. This is where they downplay the harm caused by their actions, saying things like, "oh, they weren't really hurt," or "it wasn't that big of a deal."
So they're minimizing the impact to make themselves feel better. Are there any real-world examples of these rationalizations?
Oh, absolutely. A chilling example is the Ford Pinto case from the 1970s. Ford knew about a design flaw that made the car prone to explosions in rear-end collisions. But instead of fixing it, they did a cost-benefit analysis, actually putting a dollar value on human life, and decided it was cheaper to pay out lawsuits than issue a recall.
That's horrifying. How could they justify that decision?
They used a combination of rationalizations. They denied the severity of the problem, arguing that all cars have some level of risk. They also dehumanized the victims, reducing them to numbers on a spreadsheet. And tragically, hundreds of people died or were injured as a result.
It's hard to believe that people can detach themselves from the consequences of their actions like that.
It is, and this isn't unique to Ford. We see similar rationalizations in cases of corporate fraud, environmental damage, and even human rights abuses. Another chilling example is how Nazi doctors used euphemisms to distance themselves from the horrors of the Holocaust. They talked about selection and special treatment instead of extermination, even though they knew the reality of what was happening.
So it's not just about individuals. It's about how groups reinforce these rationalizations and create a shared delusion that allows them to continue these practices.
Exactly. And that brings us to the third pillar, socialization. This is the process by which newcomers are brought into a corrupt system and gradually indoctrinated into its practices.
So how does that work in practice? Do they have like a Corruption 101 course?
Not quite, but think of it like joining a wolf pack. New members are carefully selected, often based on their perceived willingness to conform to the group's ethical standards, or lack thereof. They're then gradually exposed to corrupt practices, often starting with small things that seem harmless.
So it's a slippery slope, starting small and gradually escalating.
Exactly. And as they become more deeply embedded in the group, They're rewarded for their loyalty and silence. Those who raise concerns are ostracized, creating a powerful incentive to conform. There's research that highlights this internal struggle between individual morality and group loyalty. They tell the story of a nurse who admits to stealing supplies from the hospital, even while acknowledging that it's wrong.
She knows it's wrong, but she does it anyway.
It highlights the tension between particularistic values, which prioritize the immediate needs of the group, and universalistic values, which consider the broader good. In corrupt organizations, the particularistic values often win out, creating a sense of us versus them that further reinforces the corrupt behavior.
So we've got these three pillars: institutionalization, rationalization, and socialization, working together to create a powerful force that normalizes corruption within organizations. I'm curious, have you ever witnessed or experienced these dynamics in your own workplace? Have you ever seen someone brushing aside an ethical concern, downplaying the impact of decision, or simply going along with something that felt wrong, all in the name of how things are done?
It's a question worth reflecting on because
I'll see.
these dynamics can be incredibly subtle and pervasive, often operating below our conscious awareness.
It's definitely something I'm going to be thinking about. So we've explored how corruption becomes normalized through these three pillars. But I'm really intrigued by how our own psychology can make us susceptible to these processes. There's this research on fair market ideology that gets into some really fascinating territory about how people perceive fairness in economic systems.
That research delves into something called system justification theory. It suggests that we're naturally inclined to believe the systems we operate within are fair and just, even when evidence might suggest otherwise. We crave stability and predictability. And that deep-seated need can lead us to some interesting mental gymnastics.
So you're saying we might actually be wired to deceive ourselves when it comes to the systems that govern our lives?
It's not necessarily intentional deception, but rather a subconscious bias towards upholding the status quo. This desire to justify the system can lead us to downplay or even ignore information that challenges our beliefs, which in turn makes us more vulnerable to rationalizing corrupt practices within those systems.
That makes sense. It's almost like we'd rather believe the system is fair than face the cognitive dissonance of admitting it's flawed.
Exactly. And this desire for system justification is a powerful force. There's a fascinating study from Hungary where researchers found that individuals who scored high in self-deception were even more likely to defend the free market system when it was under threat. It's like their need to believe in the system's fairness became even stronger when it was challenged.
Wow, that's a really striking example of how our psychology can blind us to the flaws in the systems we're part of.
It's a crucial point, because if we're constantly trying to justify the system, we're less likely to see the corrupt behaviors within it for what they are, more likely to excuse them, rationalize them, or even participate in them.
No, that's a scary thought. And there's another layer to all of this that I find equally fascinating: the role of relationships in how we evaluate information, especially when it comes to sensitive topics like corruption.
You're talking about the messenger bias. This research is really important because it highlights how our relationships with the people who deliver information can drastically influence how we perceive that information.
So it's not just about the message itself, but about who's delivering it. We can't help but filter information through our personal feelings about the messenger.
Precisely. Think about it this way. If your trusted colleague raises a concern about unethical behavior, you're more likely to take it seriously than if the same concern comes from a rival or someone you distrust.
It makes sense intuitively, but it's amazing to see it backed up by research. And the research actually goes even deeper, outlining 6 specific relational schemas that influence knowledge valuation: colleague, rival, deviant, advisor, intruder, and enemy.
Each schema evokes different emotions and motivations that impact how we process information. With a colleague, there's a sense of shared identity and trust, so we're more receptive to their knowledge. But with a rival, our skepticism is heightened, and we might even be motivated to dismiss their input, even if it's accurate.
So our brains are constantly making these snap judgments about the messenger, which in turn affects how we process the message.
Absolutely. Let's look at the deviant schema, for example.
Mm-hmm.
This is someone who's perceived as an outsider within the group, maybe because they challenge norms or have different views.
Kind of like the black sheep of the organization.
Exactly. And even if they have valuable insights, their knowledge is often devalued or outright rejected because they threaten the group's sense of cohesion and shared identity. It's like a defense mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
The group rejects the deviant's knowledge to protect its own worldview.
Then you have the advisor schema, where the messenger is seen as a trusted expert or mentor. Their knowledge is highly valued, often without much critical evaluation. We tend to defer to authority figures or those we perceive as experts.
And on the flip side, there's the intruder. This is someone perceived as an outsider who's encroaching on the group's territory. Their knowledge is met with suspicion and resistance, almost like they're seen as a threat to the group's power or status.
It seems like if you're trying to raise concerns about corruption, it really matters where you fall on the spectrum of relational schemas. You better hope you're seen as a trusted colleague or advisor, rather than a deviant or an intruder.
Yeah, it's a sad reality. And then there's the most complex schema, the enemy. Their knowledge can be both alluring and threatening.
Alluring. Why would we be drawn to an enemy's knowledge?
Because it can offer strategic insights into their motives and plans. However, there's also a strong motivation to reject their information, to protect the in-group. It creates a real psychological tug-of-war.
So we're not just dealing with individual biases, but also with group dynamics and power struggles. It's starting to feel like a minefield out there.
It can be. But the key takeaway here is that understanding these biases, particularly the messenger bias, is crucial when it comes to issues like corruption. Recognizing that our relationships with messengers can dramatically color our judgment allows us to be more objective in evaluating information.
It's about taking a step back and asking ourselves, am I truly evaluating this information on its merits, or am I letting my feelings about the messenger cloud my judgment?
Exactly. And that awareness is essential if we want to create more ethical and transparent organizations.
So we've got these three pillars of normalization, this tendency to justify the systems we're in, and this messenger bias shaping how we perceive information. It's a lot to process. But how do we connect all these psychological insights to the real world of organizational behavior? How can we make sense of the seemingly contradictory ways people act in corrupt systems?
It does feel like a giant puzzle. Trying to understand why people act the way they do in these situations.
Yeah, it does.
And that's where the research on interpersonal sense-making comes in. It sheds light on how we actively construct meaning from our interactions with others, especially at work. We're not just passively absorbing information, but constantly trying to make sense of our experiences, find our place, and understand our own value.
So how does this tie into the issue of corruption?
Let's consider the research on hospital cleaners. It might seem like a far cry from corporate scandals, but it actually illustrates a key point. These cleaners often face cues that devalue their work. Low pay, lack of recognition, even being invisible to some. Yet they find ways to make their work meaningful, often through interactions with patients who express gratitude or appreciation.
So even in a system that might not value them, they're actively searching for affirmation and purpose.
Exactly. They're creating meaning through their relationships and interactions. And this same drive for affirmation and meaning-making can contribute to the rationalization of corrupt practices within organizations.
So someone might justify unethical behavior because it brings them acceptance or a sense of belonging within their work group.
Precisely. It's like they're saying to themselves, this must be okay because it's what we do here. It's how we bond. It's how I fit in. They're looking for validation and meaning within the context of a corrupt system.
That's a powerful insight. It's not always about greed or malice. Sometimes it's about the very human need to feel valued and connected.
It's a reminder that corruption isn't just a top-down phenomenon. It's something that takes root at the individual and group level through these complex social and psychological processes.
Well, this deep dive has really illuminated the subtle ways in which corruption can permeate organizations and how our own psychology can make us susceptible to it. From the three pillars of normalization to the system justification theory and the messenger bias, it's been a whirlwind tour of the darker side of human behavior.
But it's not about simply pointing fingers or feeling discouraged. The goal is to understand these processes so we can start to change them.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power. And by understanding these dynamics, we can become more aware of our own biases, challenge unethical behavior, and advocate for more ethical and transparent workplaces.
We can create cultures where integrity is valued, where speaking up is encouraged, and where the how things are done includes ethical decision-making at every level.
Right. To wrap things up, let's recap the key takeaways for our listener today. First, corruption doesn't just happen overnight. It's a process that unfolds through institutionalization, rationalization, and socialization. Understanding these three pillars helps us see how seemingly small ethical compromises can gradually snowball into larger systemic issues.
Second, we have to acknowledge that our brains are wired to justify the systems we're in, even when those systems are flawed. This system justification bias can blind us to corruption and make us more likely to rationalize unethical behavior.
Third, we learned about the messenger bias and how our relationships with those delivering information can significantly skew our judgment. Recognizing this bias is crucial when evaluating information about sensitive topics like corruption.
And finally, we explored the powerful role of interpersonal sense-making, highlighting how the need for belonging and meaning-making can lead individuals to rationalize corrupt practices in order to fit in with their work group.
Knowing what we now know about how corruption takes root, I want to leave you with a final question. What proactive steps can you take, both individually and collectively, to create more ethical and transparent workplaces? How can you become an advocate for integrity and ensure that how things are done reflects the highest ethical standards? This deep dive has given you the knowledge. Now it's time to put it into action. Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery.